So imagine turning 50, right? You finally get the green light from the government to supercharge your retirement savings,
Right.
only to find out you missed a hidden IRS deadline by a matter of hours.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And because you didn't, read the fine print, that single mistake just permanently locked you out of thousands of dollars in tax advantage space for the entire year.
It is a devastating realization. And honestly, it happens far more often than you might think.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. Simply because the underlying mechanics of these systems are, well, they're obscured by layers of tax code.
Yeah, and that is exactly why we are pulling this apart today. Welcome to the deep dive. We are talking directly to you, our listener, because the stack of research and notes you shared with us details this highly specific, incredibly valuable, and occasionally treacherous mechanism in the financial world.
It is a fascinating topic.
It really is. Today's mission is all about decoding the late-stage retirement savings sprint. We are going to look at the rules, the strict limits, and the surprisingly dramatic legislative history of something called catch-up contributions.
Which is such a crucial tool.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly, at its core, is a catch-up contribution?
So, at its core, looking at the data we have here, a catch-up contribution is a designated provision in the U.S. tax code. It basically allows individuals who are aged 50 and older to inject extra funds into their retirement accounts.
And extra meaning above the normal cap.
Right, exactly. Crucially, they are permitted to add these funds beyond the standard annual contribution limits that apply to, well, the rest of the workforce.
Okay.
The entire mechanism is structurally designed to help older workers aggressively boost their retirement savings as they near the end of their careers. It acts as this systemic acknowledgement that a massive percentage of the population inevitably starts saving later than they originally intended.
Yeah, it is the ultimate acknowledgement of reality, honestly. When I was going through the timelines in your notes, the best way I could visualize it was like running a marathon.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah, so for the first 19 miles of your adult life, your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, you are effectively running with a weighted vest of unavoidable expenses.
Oh, absolutely.
You're carrying a mortgage, you're absorbing the costs of raising children, you've got student loans, and just dealing with the sheer compounding friction of basic survival.
The vest is very heavy.
Right. You are trying to save, but that vest is dragging you down. Then you hit mile 20, which in this case is your 50th birthday. Suddenly, the rules of the race change. The government steps in and allows you to unbuckle part of that tax burden so you can actually sprint to the finish line.
What's fascinating here is the specific age threshold of 50. I mean, why not 45?
Or 60.
Right, why not 60? If we look at the behavioral economics underpinning this tax policy, age 50 is widely recognized as a psychological tipping point.
How so?
Well, when a worker is 30, retirement is a highly abstract concept.
Oh, for sure. It feels like a lifetime away.
Exactly. It is a hazy idea, hovering 3 decades in the future, easily ignored in favor of immediate financial pressures. But age 50 triggers a documented shift in perspective.
It gets real.
Yes. The abstraction crystallizes into a looming, tangible reality. You can essentially see the finish line of your working years on the horizon. The policy we are analyzing effectively weaponizes that psychological shift.
Weaponizes it. That's a good word.
It capitalizes on the urgency or, perhaps the mild panic that sets in at 50, providing the legal framework to maximize savings exactly when the motivation to do so is at its absolute peak.
But that brings up a fundamental question about the architecture of our tax system. I mean, if the ultimate goal of the federal government is to get people to save enough money so they aren't relying entirely on the state when they hit 65, why have limits in the first place?
That is the big question.
Right. And more to the point, why force people to wait until they are 50 to unlock this bonus tier of saving capacity? If a, say, 35-year-old wants to live frugally and save aggressively, why is the IRS capping their ability to do so?
It is a totally valid question, and answering it requires looking at the dual mandate of the tax code. We have to remember the core trade-off of a tax-advantaged account, like a traditional 401k or IRA.
Okay, what's the trade-off?
Every dollar you defer into that account is a dollar the federal government cannot tax today.
Right.
There's a constant high-stakes tension between the Treasury's immediate need for tax revenue to fund current national operations and the government's long-term desire to keep you solvent in your old age.
Ah, so they need the cash flow now.
Exactly. If the IRS removed those limits entirely, high-net-worth individuals would simply shelter massive swaths of their income from taxation.
And current federal revenues would just plummet.
The limits are the dam holding the tax base together.
So the limits are just there to ensure the government still gets paid today.
Precisely. But then the catch-up mechanism is introduced as a highly regulated pressure valve on that dam.
I see.
By enforcing the age 50 waiting period, the government is essentially saying, look, we cannot afford to let you shelter unlimited capital throughout your entire life. However, we recognize that as you enter the final phase of your career, you might be dangerously behind.
So it's very targeted.
Very. The catch-up offers profound tax benefits, but it targets that relief exclusively to the demographic window, where it is most critical for preventing old age insolvency.
Targeted relief makes sense in theory, but, looking at the historical data in the research you sent us, the rollout of this relief was anything but smooth.
Oh, it was a mess.
Yeah. These rules didn't just appear as a permanent, logical cornerstone of American finance. They were born out of a very specific legislative environment and, frankly, a chaotic one.
They really were. Catch-up contributions are a relatively modern feature of the tax code. The provision was initially created by the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2001.
That's EGTRI, right?
Right, commonly referred to as EGTRRA. That specific piece of legislation is what officially altered the code to allow older workers to set aside more earnings for retirement.
Right, EGTRRA in 2001. But let's dig into the reality of that law, because there is a detail here that completely undercuts the idea of secure retirement planning.
The sunset provision.
Yes. Originally, the catch-up contributions created under EGTRA were scheduled to expire entirely at the end of 2010.
Yep.
Wait, you're telling me Congress built this vital bridge for older folks to accelerate their savings, but they basically rigged it to explode in 10 years?
Wow.
Why would you make a retirement tool temporary?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains a lot about how economic policy is actually shaped by legislative procedure rather than pure financial logic. The key word in that 2001 act is reconciliation.
Okay.
In the U.S. Senate, a reconciliation bill is a specific mechanism used to bypass the filibuster.
Meaning they don't need 60 votes.
Exactly. A party only needs a simple majority of 51 votes to pass tax and spending changes.
It's basically the nuclear option for taxes.
It is. But it comes with a massive procedural catch known as the Byrd Rule. Under the Byrd Rule, any legislation passed via reconciliation cannot increase the federal deficit beyond a specific budgetary window, which is typically 10 years.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Because allowing people to shelter more money in retirement accounts technically reduces federal tax revenue, EGTRA, increase the deficit on paper. Therefore, to comply with the rules of reconciliation, the authors of the bill had to include a sunset provision.
Wow.
They had to program the law to automatically expire in 2010 so it wouldn't violate the 10-year deficit rule.
So the 2010 expiration had absolutely nothing to do with whether a 55-year-old actually needed the savings tool.
Nothing at all.
It was just a mandatory accounting gimmick to force the math to work within the Senate rule.
It was pure parliamentary math. But consider the psychological toll that accounting gimmick took on the actual saver.
Yeah, imagine relying on that.
Think about the individual who is, say, 52 years old in 2003. They are looking at their portfolio, realizing they are behind, and they start heavily utilizing these new catch-up limits, but they are building their entire late-stage financial model on a tax law that is legally mandated to vanish in 7 years.
That completely shatters the fundamental requirement of retirement planning, which is, long-term predictability.
Exactly.
You cannot confidently model a 30-year retirement on a tax provision that might disappear before you even leave the workforce. I mean, if you are throwing an extra few $1,000s a year into an account based on the assumption of a certain tax deduction, and that deduction vanishes, your entire cash flow projection just falls apart.
Which is why the subsequent legislation was so vital. The uncertainty hung over the market for years until the passage of the Pension Protection Act of 2006.
The rescue mission.
Pretty much. The PPA of 2006 took those temporary catch-up provisions, along with a suite of other pension-related rules, and officially made them permanent parts of the tax code.
And if you are listening to this right now, the 2006 Pension Protection Act is the invisible architecture supporting your current financial reality.
Yes, it is.
If you sit down this weekend and run a retirement calculator, projecting your wealth accumulation from age 50 to 65, you are relying entirely on the permanence established in 2006. It removed the sunset provision, allowing you to actually trust the math.
It secured the bridge. And since we know the bridge isn't going to collapse, we need to examine the actual load capacity it can handle today. The numbers dictate the strategy.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because the limits are not static. The IRS doesn't just set a contribution ceiling and walk away.
No, they don't.
They are required to review and adjust these contribution limits annually to account for inflation. Looking at the exact figures from the notes for 2026, the standard DUS limit for a 401k is pushed up to $24,500.
Right.
But the data for individual retirement accounts, the IRAs, is where the math gets highly specific. For 2026, the designated catch-up contribution for an IRA is an extra $1,100, bringing the total allowed IRA contribution to $8,600.
And just to clarify the baseline there, if the total limit is $8,600 and $1,100 of that is the age 50 catch-up.
That means the standard baseline IRA contribution limit for anyone under 50 in 2026 is exactly $7,500.
Correct.
But let's look closer at that $1,100 catch-up figure. It is an incredibly jagged, uneven number. I mean, why wouldn't the IRS just set it at a clean $1,000 or a flat $1,500? Where does a number like $1,100 even come from?
That jaggedness is the visual footprint of the inflation indexing we just mentioned. The IRS isn't choosing round numbers that look good on a marketing brochure.
Truly not.
No. They are mechanically tying these limits to specific economic indicators like the Consumer Price Index. Think about the destructive nature of inflation if these limits were static.
Oh, it'd be awful.
Right? If the IRS had set the catch-up at $1,000 back in 2001 and never touched it, the actual purchasing power of that $1,000 would be heavily degraded 25 years later.
Yeah, $1,000 in 2001 is a vastly different economic unit than $1,000 in 2026.
Exactly. If the limit didn't move, the law would effectively be forcing older workers to save less real value every single year. So the IRS uses complex indexing formulas to adjust the limits. But they don't adjust them by exact dollar amounts.
How do they do it?
They usually adjust them in specific increments, like rounding to the nearest $100 for smaller limits or the nearest $500 for larger ones like the 401k base. That $1,100 figure is the mathematical result of the baseline catch-up amount being adjusted upward just enough to maintain its original purchasing power against current inflationary drag.
So it's a vital defense mechanism against economic drift.
Precisely.
But let's play devil's advocate on that specific $1,100 amount for a moment. I can hear someone looking at that number and thinking, an extra $1,100 a year? I'm trying to fund 20 years of retirement living. Is $1,100 really going to move the needle?
I hear that a lot.
Let's break down the actual gravity of that number over time. If a listener turns 50 and commits to maxing out just that specific IRA catch-up provision every year until they hit 65,
You are looking at a 15-year accumulation window.
15 years multiplied by $1,100 a year is $16,500 in pure principal, just the raw cash you have deferred. Now, $16,500 is a meaningful amount of money. It's a massive emergency fund or, a used car, but it's not retiring on a beach money.
But framing it as just $16,500 ignores the entire engine of the account.
Yeah.
You aren't putting that $1,100 under a floorboard.
Exactly.
You are deploying it into a tax-advantaged investment vehicle. The money is entering the market.
Yes. The $1,100 you deposited at age 50 doesn't just sit there. It has 15 years of market exposure to grow and compound. And then the $1,100 you put in at age 51 has 14 years to compound. You are earning returns on your initial principal, and then you are earning returns on those returns.
And that compounding effect dramatically transforms the value of the catch-up. Depending on your asset allocation and market performance over that decade and a half, that $16,500 in principal could generate tens of thousands of dollars in actual account balance by the time you reach 65.
That's the magic of it.
The relatively small, jagged limit of $1,100 acts as a continuous annual lever. It forces you to steadily acquire assets during your peak earning years, and the compounding math turns those modest incremental deposits into massive financial flexibility later.
Okay, so we understand the history securing the policy, and we understand the mathematical power of the limits. But having the money and the legal right to save it is only half the equation.
Right.
You have to know exactly where the IRS allows you to park this capital. Because based on the research you provided, the federal government does not treat all retirement accounts equally. We're looking at a highly segmented landscape.
The landscape is heavily segmented, mostly based on how you earn your income. The data outlines the primary eligible accounts.
Let's go through them.
In the employer-sponsored tier, you have the ubiquitous 401k for the private sector. You have 403b plans, which serve public school employees, universities, and certain nonprofit organizations. Then there are 457 plans, typically utilized by state and local government employees.
Okay, and outside of that employer ecosystem,
You move into the individual tier. You have traditional IRAs and Roth IRAs, which are untethered from your employer.
right.
And for the self-employed or those running small businesses, The code provides the simple IRA and the simplified employee pension, or SEP plan.
It is a dizzying array of options, honestly. But there's one specific nuance in the data regarding the 403B that absolutely stood out to me.
The 15-year rule.
Yes. The rules are not totally uniform across these plans. The text highlights this unique carve-out. Employees with at least 15 years of service might actually be eligible to make additional contributions to a 403B plan.
Yep.
And this is on top of the standard age 50 catch-up we've been discussing.
Yes, the 15-year rule for 403B plans. It is a highly specialized secondary tier of contribution limit that is entirely decoupled from your age.
When I read that, the immediate comparison that came to mind was a corporate loyalty rewards program.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Think about an airline status tier. You fly a certain number of miles with one specific carrier, and eventually they bump you up to platinum. Suddenly you unlock early boarding and free upgrades. Here, a nonprofit employer, say a hospital system or a school district, is operating under a tax provision that essentially says, you have dedicated 15 continuous years to our specific organization. In exchange for that massive institutional loyalty, the tax code is going to unlock a secret capacity for you to shelter even more of your income.
That analogy holds up perfectly because it highlights the exact utility of the rule. It is a retention tool embedded directly into the federal tax code.
Wow.
Think about the sectors that primarily use 403B accounts: education, healthcare, charitable organizations. These are often fields where the baseline compensation might be lower than the private sector equivalent.
Sure.
By allowing a 15-year veteran teacher or nurse to aggressively shelter more of their late career income, the organization provides a massive financial benefit without having to directly fund a higher salary today.
It incentivizes them not to jump ship to a private company at age 45.
Precisely. And it draws a hard line between how different accounts function. A 403B or a 401k is intimately tied to your W-2. Your tenure matters. Your employer's specific plan document matters.
And the IRA.
An IRA, on the other hand, is completely indifferent to your employment history. The IRA doesn't care if you've been at your job for 15 years or 15 minutes. It only cares about your age and your earned income.
Understanding that separation is critical. But as we were analyzing this hierarchy of accounts, I had a massive conceptual paradox in the source material itself. I really want to challenge the way this entire concept is framed.
Okay, let's hear it.
The notes explicitly state that it is essential to begin contributing early, so there's no need to make catch-up contributions later.
Ah, I see the tension there.
Yeah. The document is outlining this incredibly powerful, mathematically vital tool, but then it essentially wags its finger at the reader and says, but if you did things right, you'd never use this. It frames the catch-up contribution almost like a failure condition. Is the ultimate goal of this policy to make itself obsolete?
It's an astute observation. The text is leaning heavily into optimal financial theory, framing early, consistent saving as Plan A.
Right.
Plan A assumes you secure a high-paying job at 22. You immediately begin deferring 15% of your income. You never experience a prolonged period of unemployment. You never endure a catastrophic medical event. Your investments always yield historical averages. And by the time you are 50, your portfolio is perfectly on track.
But let's inject a dose of reality here. I mean, how many people actually live a frictionless Plan A existence?
Statistically, an incredibly small minority, and this is where we have to push back on the framing in the text. Life is fundamentally volatile.
Exactly.
Divorces decimate household wealth. Market crashes wipe out years of accumulation. People make conscious, necessary choices to exit the workforce for a decade to raise children or care for aging parents. Plan A is an academic ideal. The reality of the human economic experience is messy.
So the catch-up contribution shouldn't be viewed as a penalty box for people who failed at Plan A.
Absolutely not. It is a necessary structural acknowledgement of reality. The government designed these provisions precisely because they know the friction of life interrupts early accumulation.
So it's Plan B.
Exactly. So while the text suggests it's essential to start early to avoid needing the catch-up, I would argue that acknowledging the reality of financial interruption makes the catch-up provision essential in its own right. It is a lifeline, deliberately engineered for the majority of the population who inevitably face setbacks.
A lifeline, not a penalty box. I think that is the exact right way to conceptualize it. However, if you are listening to this and preparing to grab that lifeline, we need to transition into the most dangerous part of this deep dive.
The fine print.
Because this system is not forgiving. It is surrounded by strict boundaries, hidden traps, and severe deadlines that can trip up even the most proactive saver.
The execution of the strategy is where the theory hits the rigid reality of tax enforcement.
Let's start with the deadlines, because this is where the system feels incredibly punitive. The data specifies the timeline for funding an individual retirement account. You are allowed to make contributions for a specific tax year up until your federal tax filing date of the following year.
Right.
For most people, that means you have until roughly April 15th to finalize your IRA contributions for the previous calendar year. But here is the trap. The text is crystal clear that your contribution must be made before that standard April deadline, and it is strictly not eligible for extensions.
This raises an important question. Why does the IRS draw such a draconian line in the sand regarding IRA contributions, especially when they routinely grant extensions for the actual filing of tax paperwork?
Right. You can easily file a form to push your tax return deadline to October, so why can't you push your IRA funding deadline to October?
It feels entirely contradictory.
If the government wants me to save and they are giving me an extension to calculate my taxes, why cut off my ability to actually fund the retirement account?
Because you have to look at the IRA deadline, not just as a date on a calendar, but as a systemic clearinghouse mechanism for the entire national tax apparatus.
A clearinghouse mechanism.
Yes. The April 15th deadline forces a hard stop on capital movement for the previous year. Imagine the chaos if the IRS allowed millions of taxpayers to retroactively fund their IRAs 6 months later in October.
Oh, man.
It would create a rolling, never-ending wave of recalculated tax liabilities, adjusted gross incomes, and shifting market basis.
The accounting would never actually settle.
Exactly. By dropping a heavy, unmovable gate in April, the IRS forces the financial year to permanently close. It provides necessary systemic finality.
But the consequence of that systemic finality falls entirely on the individual saver.
100%.
If you file for a tax extension, relax, and then wake up on April 16th realizing you forgot to execute your $1,100 catch-up transfer for the previous year, you are out of luck. The window is hermetically sealed. You cannot petition the IRS to open it. That specific year of tax advantage space is gone forever.
That is a brutal reality check. You have to treat April 15th as an absolute operational hard stop for your IRA, regardless of your paperwork extensions.
Okay, so that is the deadline trap. But there is a second major pitfall in the data that I'm going to call the employer match mirage. And this is where assumptions can cost you dearly.
Oh, this is a big one.
When a worker defers their standard percentage into a 401k, let's say 5%, many employers offer a matching contribution. It is the closest thing to free money in the financial world. So human intuition naturally assumes that when you turn 50 and start funneling extra thousands of dollars into that same account under the catch-up provision, your employer will just match that money at the same rate.
But human intuition is wrong in this case.
Yep.
The source material explicitly warns against this assumption. Employer matching for catch-up contributions is neither required by federal law, nor is it guaranteed by standard plan architecture.
It's totally variable.
Whether or not your specific employer matches those extra funds depends entirely on the intricate wording of their customized plan document.
It is a total mirage. You could be aggressively deferring an extra $7,500 into your 401k this year, expecting a proportional match to hit your account, and your payroll system is just silently processing the deferral without kicking in a single extra dime of corporate money.
Which is painful to discover after the fact.
You cannot assume continuity. You have to actively interrogate your HR department or read the actual plan summary to confirm how they treat age 50 funds.
And that failure of assumption leads perfectly into the third and mathematically most complex boundary detailed in the data.
This one is tricky.
This rule is a massive stumbling block, and we need to meticulously break down the mechanics here so the listener understands their absolute legal ceiling.
Okay.
The text states that participants cannot contribute more than, and I will quote the exact phrasing here, the excess of the participant's compensation over elective deferral contributions that are not catch-up contributions.
Okay, my brain just short-circuited. Excess of compensation over elective deferrals. That is impenetrable tax code speak. Let's translate that into human English. What exactly is the W-2 ceiling rule?
Let's build a real-world scenario to solve the math puzzle.
Okay.
Let's imagine a hypothetical worker. She is 55 years old, she is semi-retired from her primary career, and she's now working a part-time consulting job. For the current tax year, her total gross compensation from this job, her exact W-2 income, is $30,000.
Okay, we have a fixed gross income of $30,000.
Now, she is highly motivated to catch up on her retirement. She knows the standard 401k contribution limit for 2026 is $24,500. So she decides to aggressively defer $24,500 of her $30,000 salary straight into her 401k.
She is basically living off outside savings to do that, but legally she has deferred $24,500.
Right, so we run the first calculation. Compensation over elective deferrals. Her compensation is $30,000. Her elective deferrals are $24,500. We subtract the deferral from the compensation. $30,000 minus $24,500 leaves her with exactly $5,500 of remaining recognizable compensation from that job.
I'm tracking the math perfectly so far. She has $5,500 of her paycheck left.
Now, she remembers she is over 50. She wants to execute a catch-up contribution on top of her standard limit. Let's say the law allows a maximum catch-up of $7,500 for that year.
Okay.
She has cash sitting in a checking account from an inheritance, so she decides she wants to put the full $7,500 catch-up into her 401k. But the IRS rule, the excessive compensation rule, drops like an anvil.
Boom.
The law dictates that her catch-up contribution cannot exceed the compensation she has left over after her initial deferrals. She only has $5,500 of W-2 income left from that job.
Right.
Therefore, her absolute legal ceiling for the catch-up contribution is capped at $5,500. She is legally barred from hitting the $7,500 federal limit.
Wait, let me push back on the philosophy of that rule. If she has the cash, maybe from her spouse's income or an inheritance, why does the IRS care if she uses it to max out her account? Isn't that W-2 ceiling rule unfairly penalizing single-income households or part-time workers who are trying to catch up using shared household wealth?
It absolutely restricts them, but the policy design is highly intentional. A 401k or a 403b is fundamentally an employer-sponsored plan.
Okay.
The tax shielding is granted specifically as a function of your labor for that specific employer. The IRS rule exists to prevent individuals from turning their workplace retirement plan into a generalized tax shelter for outside unearned wealth.
I see.
You cannot use a part-time job as a laundering mechanism to shield an inheritance from taxes. The capacity to defer is strictly bound to the actual labor value, the W-2 compensation generated in that calendar year. You cannot defer money you did not personally earn from that specific employer.
That clarifies the mechanism completely. It is a strict firewall between earned labor compensation and outside wealth. You cannot pour outside water into the employer's tax-advantaged bucket. Thank you for walking through that puzzle. It makes a highly abstract rule very tangible.
My pleasure.
So we have mapped the minefield. We understand the unyielding April deadline for IRAs. We know to verify the employer match mirage. And we understand the hard mathematical ceiling of the compensation rule.
All critical checkpoints.
To synthesize all of this, I want to zoom out from the individual rules and look at the broader ecosystem. The data provided some incredibly detailed metrics on the current health and structure of the modern 401k landscape, which is where the vast majority of these late-stage savings sprints are actually being executed. And honestly, the data paints a surprisingly optimistic picture.
It does. The source material notes some distinct operational shifts in how modern employer plans are structured compared to previous decades.
Like what?
A critical detail is that the average 401k plan now offers roughly 24 different investment options. These are deliberately curated to allow employees to balance varying degrees of market risk and potential reward based on their individual timeline.
But the data doesn't stop at just the options. It also highlights a critical shift in the cost of investing. The text states that fund expenses and active management fees within these plans have either remained flat or have actively declined across the industry.
That's huge.
And because of these structural improvements, along with better educational initiatives, they project continuous boosts in employee participation. So what does this all mean for the listener? When I synthesize this, it suggests that despite the complexity of the tax code we just discussed, the actual mechanism of investing, the 401k platform itself, has evolved into a significantly more consumer-friendly environment.
That is the correct read on the data. The industry has refined the user experience. But I want to drill down deeply into that specific metric of the investment options. The text noted about 24 options.
Right, 24 options.
That is an incredibly specific, highly calibrated number, and it is the direct result of the financial industry reacting to a well-documented psychological phenomenon known as the paradox of choice.
The paradox of choice. Let's explore the mechanics of that, because I think everyone has experienced it in one form or another.
The paradox essentially dictates that while humans believe they want infinite choices, being presented with too many options actually induces severe cognitive overload.
Okay, that makes sense.
If you give a saver too few options, they feel trapped and unable to execute their specific strategy. But if you give them too many, they experience choice paralysis. They become so terrified of making the wrong optimized choice that they make no choice at all, which is the worst possible outcome in retirement planning.
Yeah, inaction is the killer.
Imagine a 50-year-old logging into their portal to invest their $7,500 catch-up contribution, and the employer presents them with a completely unfiltered menu of 4,000 distinct mutual funds.
Oh, man. The cognitive friction there is immense. Speaking from personal experience, if I saw 4,000 options, I would immediately close the browser tab. The fear of picking the suboptimal fund out of 4,000 would paralyze me. I would probably leave the money in a zero-interest cash settlement account just to avoid making a mistake.
Exactly. You freeze.
Hmm.
Conversely, imagine the employer only offers two options: a highly volatile emerging markets equity fund and a hyper-conservative government bond fund.
Then you have the opposite problem. You have no ability to actually calibrate your risk. A 50-year-old might need moderate growth, and neither of those extremes works.
Precisely. What the data in the text reflects is that the industry has stress-tested this psychological threshold. They discovered that roughly 24 options is the optimal Goldilocks zone.
The sweet spot.
It is a large enough menu to provide genuine diversification, allowing you to allocate across large domestic companies, small-cap stocks, international markets, corporate bonds, and target date retirement funds. It gives the saver the granular control they need to balance risk. But critically, 24 is a small enough number that a human being can actually read through the entire list in one sitting without suffering cognitive collapse.
That's brilliant.
It is a highly curated, psychologically optimized menu designed to compel action rather than paralysis.
The psychology of design is fascinating. They're engineering the platform to force you to making a decision, but let's connect that curated menu to the other major data point: the declining fees.
Oh, this is essential.
Because when you are executing a late-stage saving sprint, when you only have 10 or 15 years left for the market to do its work, the drag coefficient of management fees is arguably the most critical metric in your entire portfolio.
It is the silent killer of compounding interest. And this is why the trend of declining expenses noted in the text is so vital for the listener to understand. Let's revisit the math we did earlier regarding the 15-year sprint from age 50 to 65.
Okay, the $16,500 principle.
When the expense ratio of a mutual fund declines by even a fraction of a percent, say, dropping from a 1.0% annual fee to a 0.5% annual fee, that 0.5% difference feels negligible on a month-to-month basis.
Right, 0.5% on a few $1,000s doesn't seem like it warrants much attention.
But the math of fee drag is just as exponential as the math of compounding growth. Over a 15-year accumulation phase, that seemingly tiny 0.5% difference doesn't just apply to your initial contribution. It applies to your total accumulated balance every single year.
I see.
A high fee continuously skims off the top layer of your growth, permanently removing those dollars from the compounding cycle. By the time you reach 65, that 0.5% reduction in fees equates to thousands, potentially tens of thousands of dollars that remain securely in your account working for you, rather than being siphoned off by the institutional fund manager.
That is massive.
The fact that the structural trend of the 401k industry is pointing toward level or declining fees represents a massive compounding tailwind for anyone utilizing these catch-up limits today.
It really is a convergence of favorable conditions.
Yeah.
You have the federal government providing the legal capacity to shelter more income, and the financial industry simultaneously providing a psychologically curated, increasingly cost-efficient environment to actually deploy that capital.
Exactly. The tools are there.
So, listener, we have dismantled an immense amount of technical architecture today based on the research you brought us. Let's pull all these threads together and solidify the absolute core takeaways, the operational non-negotiables from this deep dive.
Let's do it.
Number 1, the absolute trigger point is age 50. The moment you hit that milestone, the tax code acknowledges the heavy vest you've been wearing and legally permits you to accelerate your savings.
Right.
Number 2, you must know the precise mathematical parameters of the field. For 2026, the standard 401k baseline increases to $24,500. If you are operating an IRA, you get that specific inflation-calibrated catch-up bump of $1,100, which pushes your total maximum IRA capacity to $8,600.
And remember the traps.
Yes. Number 3, do not fall victim to the procedural traps. You have to respect the unforgiving April deadline for IRAs because the IRS demands absolute clearinghouse finality zero extensions are permitted for funding. Furthermore, you must aggressively verify your specific employer's matching policy because a match on catch-up fund is never a guarantee.
Right.
And lastly, remember the strict W-2 firewall.
Yeah.
Your contributions cannot exceed the actual compensation you have remaining after your initial deferrals.
Those are the rigid operational parameters.
Okay.
But if we elevate the perspective, the ultimate takeaway from this data is about individual agency.
Exactly. I want to emphasize to you, the listener, that the mechanical rules we've discussed today are not just abstract financial trivia. This is a tangible, structural toolkit. It is the legal mechanism for reclaiming control over your economic trajectory.
It really is.
If you are looking at your accounts and feeling a sense of dread, feeling like you are irreparably behind, this data represents the federal tax code actively shifting to work in your favor. It provides profound tax relief exactly when you have the peak earning capacity to exploit it. It is entirely about taking command of the final stretch of your career.
It is about maximizing the tools available. But as we close out this analysis, I want to leave you with one final unwritten concept to ponder, something that builds directly on the mechanics we discussed, but projects them into the shifting reality of the future.
Okay, what's the thought?
We have spent this entire hour analyzing the psychological trigger of age 50 and the traditional finish line of age 65. But consider the current macroeconomic and biological trends.
Things are changing.
Rapidly. If modern medicine continues to extend our lifespans, and if the nature of knowledge work allows for unprecedented flexibility, we are rapidly approaching an era where working well into our 70s will become routine, whether driven by financial necessity or a desire for continued purpose.
That's true. People are working longer.
If the 30-year retirement becomes the standard, will this seemingly rigid, arbitrary catch-up age of 50 soon feel entirely outdated? We might be transitioning into an economic reality where we don't just rely on catch-up contributions in our 50s. We might require the legislative creation of a completely new peer, a second act contribution designed specifically for wealth accumulation in our 60s and 70s.
Wow, second act contribution.
I challenge you to think about how your own personal timeline might completely defy that traditional 65-year-old finish line, and how your strategy will need to adapt when the old rules no longer apply.
That is a phenomenal perspective to end on. The regulatory landscape is never truly static. It eventually bends to demographic reality. Listener, thank you for handing us this mission and joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the prevailing logic, keep analyzing the fine print, and we will catch you next time.